Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to see you all here. Thank you for coming to today's first briefing. I am Tanya Moultrie-Pace. I am the interim president and CEO of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, or NNEDV. NNEDV was founded more than 35 years ago and is dedicated to creating the social, political, and economic environment in which domestic violence no longer exists. We represent the 56 state and territory domestic violence coalitions. There are more than 2,000 local domestic violence program members and the millions of survivors that they serve and advocate for, some of whom you'll hear from today. I want to acknowledge that this topic can be very heavy and that you will hear some things today that will be probably very difficult. We aren't going to shy away from the reality of domestic violence, but if you need to step outside, if you need to grab a glass of water, totally understand, and please feel free to do so. Additionally, I want to be able to say that as we are launching our 20th annual domestic violence count report, that this report is then just a snapshot in time of a 24-hour period. This documents the number of people who sought services from local programs, the types of services that those folks requested, the number of requests programs couldn't meet due to the lack of resources, and the daily barriers programs face in providing services to victims and their families. You can read this year's report at NNEDV.org/DVcounts, or if you grabbed a summary on your way in, you can scan that QR code at the bottom of the page. If you did not grab a summary on your way in, we encourage you to check out our back table where we have all the state summaries as well as the national summary. For 2 decades, Domestic Violence Count has been a premier and trusted source of data on the life-saving services advocates provide to survivors. Today, you'll learn the new DV Counts data. You'll hear from our esteemed panelists, and we'll learn what members of Congress can do and are currently doing to advance safety and justice for survivors. Before I get into that, though, I really want to take some time to thank an amazing team from NNEDV that has made all of this possible. Thank you. I also want to thank our sponsors for this year's report. We have a gold sponsor, which is Amazon, our silver sponsor, which is Element 74, and our bronze sponsor is the National Football League Foundation. Additionally, we want to thank the honorary congressional co-hosts of this year's briefing for their steadfast support of survivors and of NNEDV's work. Representative Debbie Dingell of Michigan, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and Representative Gwen Moore of Wisconsin, and you'll hear from Representatives Dingell and Moore shortly. Finally, and most importantly, we extend our deepest gratitude to survivors and to advocates who shared their stories in this year's report. And for that, we thank them so very much. Round of applause for those folks. So when someone reaches out to a domestic violence program for help, it is often during their lowest, scariest times and most difficult. And when an advocate answers that call or opens that shelter door, it can save lives. And that's really when the hope and healing can begin. Yet, I want us to think about what happens when there are no advocates to answer that call. No one to open up that shelter door. Due to lack of funding and resources, this is becoming a reality for more and more programs across the country every day. Victims remain in danger, they stay stuck with abusers, and sometimes, unfortunately, they do not survive. NNEDV has been conducting our DV Counts survey for 20 years to provide accurate, unduplicated information about how survivors are using our services and what happens when their needs go unmet, and the legislative changes that can make a difference. Our 20th survey took place on September 10th of 2025. I want to share with you some of the top line numbers from this year's report. On the survey day, 1,707 programs in all 56 states and U.S. territories participated. Programs served more than 84,000 adults and children, including more than 53,000 in shelter and housing, more than 30,000 with non-residential supportive services such as counseling, transportation, legal support, and more. Hotlines received more than 23,000 calls, chat, text messages, emails, and other contacts, more than 16 contacts every single minute of that day. Advocates provided more than 800 educational sessions in nearly 19,000 members to nearly 19,000 members of their communities, helping raise awareness and promote resources. But despite all these tireless efforts and incredible accomplishments on survey day, programs simply did not have enough resources. On that day, September 10th, programs were unable to meet more than 13,000 requests for services, primarily the request for housing and shelter because they didn't have enough resources, staff, or funding. So I just want us to sit with that number for a moment. More than 13,000 times in one day, an advocate had to say, sorry, we can't help you. Thousands of survivors and their children were turned away. I want you to imagine for a moment what that does to a person who is reaching out for help. I want you to imagine what that does to the very fabric of our communities where people are supposed to feel safe. And more importantly, I want you to imagine how much that empowers and emboldens those who commit violence when they have repeatedly told the survivor, no one will help you. Our report also captures stories from both survivors and advocates, like this one from an advocate in Massachusetts. Emergency shelters are full more now than not, leaving survivors with nowhere to turn. Rent prices are at record highs and far beyond what most survivors can afford as they try to rebuild their lives. Survivors aren't searching for housing. They're navigating systems full of barriers where urgent needs are met with long waits, closed doors, and limited support. The path to safety should not be this hard. As you'll hear today, a lack of resources and funding has devastating consequences for victims and their children. It leaves survivors with no real options, forcing many of them to stay with their abusers or risk homelessness. We also recognize that homelessness for women and children, the number one cause is domestic violence. So I want to leave you with one of the most striking findings from this year's report. Programs were asked, how long could they sustain their services if hypothetically federal funding was reduced by 50% or more? Within 6 months, 54% of programs reported that they would be forced to close their doors. Within a year, that number would jump to 77%. Hundreds of programs wiped out from communities just like yours and mine. Thousands and thousands of survivors with their children would have no place to go. Funding for domestic violence programs cannot wait. Additional resources must be provided, and they must be provided today. They must be provided now. They should have been provided yesterday. So as we begin to move into our program and allow you to hear from these lovely folks on our panel, I just want to thank you again for joining us. You're going to hear from our panelists here shortly. I want to just make sure that we introduce them so you know who they are. So we have down at the end Melina Malazzo, who is our policy director at the National Network to End Domestic Violence. We have Molly Voiles, who is from the Texas Council on Family Violence. We have Vivian Huego, who is with Esperanza United, and Shahara Johnson, who's a survivor. Do we have? Okay. All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to turn everything over to Representative Moore, who has joined us. So Representative Moore has been an unparalleled champion in advancing safety and justice for survivors through legislation such as the Violence Against Women Act, and a stalwart champion in securing funds for survivors through the appropriations process. We are incredibly grateful for her ongoing and tireless support. Please join me in welcoming Representative Gwen Moore of Wisconsin.
Uh-oh, I'm messing up already. Listen, I really want to thank the hosts, my good friends, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, for bringing us all together here for this briefing on domestic violence counts briefing. And I noticed the placards here of the numbers of children who are served within a day, and of course the numbers of people who cannot be served because we don't have the resources to meet their needs. As a survivor, I'm really glad that y'all exist. But as I've often said, and the National Network knows that I want to put y'all out of business. That's my goal. that one day when my great grandbabies say, gee, was there really such a thing as domestic violence? I want to be say, oh, not anymore, because of the work of people in this room. That domestic violence will be a thing no more. That, aggressors will find some other way to communicate other than hitting and killing their domestic partners. As advocates and direct service providers, you are our North Star, and you're my personal sheroes and heroes. If we're serious about ending domestic violence and sexual assault, Congress and this administration must match the commitment with action. And this means recognizing that data is our superpower. And data like the DV Count survey helps us see the truth. These are not just numbers, y'all. These are people, and they help us to understand where people need help, and they make the case that for real we need enduring change. It also means enduring robust funding that arrives on time. How many people know about the on time part? Because delays don't just impact programs, they impact people. Can you imagine telling some woman on the phone, or letting the phone ring and say, we'll answer it as soon as our funding stream comes in and we can pay the phone bill? That just won't work. Just as an aside from my notes here, my daughter and I are going to take a trip this weekend just so we can go and revisit a place where we were subjected to domestic violence in this country 54 years ago. It never goes away, y'all. That need, and we, in fact, were rescued from our situation by regular old people. We're going to go visit one of the people who rescued us. There was no hotline to call. There was no shelter to go to. It was just people like Martha Jane, who's an octogenarian now. We want to see her before she leaves us. But that's what we need. We can't just rely on Martha Jane. We got to have networks and organizations and phones where the phones are answered. It means investing in culturally specific programs. I mean, we know from our experience here that being a woman was regarded as DEI. Programs that were going to help women, we got to say, persons who may be involved in domestic, y'all, it's women that's dying every day and getting killed. Let's be clear about that. And we need culturally specific programs. Not only that, we have seen the need for, can you imagine being a person who your first language is Spanish and you got to go to a shelter where through your tears and sobs and pain and wounds, you're at the ER, you got to explain in English what you've experienced, or you got to explain to the court system in English what you need, or to show up at a shelter as a Muslim and they're serving, pork brisket. That would be good to me, but, just saying. So we need cultural competence, cultural specific programs, so that, because survivors need people who they can trust, people who can relate to them, people who understand. So my goal is to put all y'all out of business. But until that day, you can count on me to keep pushing for better data, reliable funding, and stronger community investments. Thank y'all all for listening to me.
Amen. Let's all get put out of a job and move on. I am with that. Absolutely. All right. Well, the next person I would like for you to join me in welcoming is Representative Debbie Dingell of Michigan. She is a longstanding champion of survivors on a variety of issues, including common sense legislation to reduce domestic violence homicides. She launched and co-chairs the bipartisan working group to end domestic violence and is the lead sponsor of key legislation addressing gender-based violence. Join me in welcoming Representative Debbie Dingell.
So good afternoon, everybody. And I'm just going to say a couple of words from my heart because Gwen, who is my wonderful co-chair and partner, really laid out the statistics well. But this is celebrating the 20th anniversary of Domestic Violence Report. And we've made progress, but far from enough. And I worry that we are going backwards. I stand here, many of you know my story, and I listened to Gwen. I'm not sure I would go back to anything or remind myself of any of what I experienced, because when I was a child, I remember I remember one of the nights when I was convinced we were going to die that night. When we were hiding in the closet, my father took the doorknobs off every door, and I called the police, and they wouldn't come. They thought, oh, that's the house on the hill. We don't, it's a child calling about her father. You don't do anything about it. And where I will tell you that we have made progress is that law enforcement does not ignore those calls now. And they are the most dangerous calls that law enforcement can respond to. But I'm looking at the times that we are in. I'm going to say a couple of things to you. First is, we got VAWA passed. Took forever to get it reauthorized. Shouldn't have. Yes, I will admit that my amendment or my bill that was part of that was part of the reason, because I do not believe that anybody who has been convicted, due process of domestic abuse with a gun should be allowed to have a gun. That the Supreme Court, I'm not sure I'm going to hold my breath, but I'm praying. But I've spent a lot of time with my groups now back home, which many of you know, and people the money isn't coming through. It's the grants aren't there. I see, how many people weren't helped in one day. I've met Rashida Tlaib is now going with me to, we do a lot of this. We go to our shelters together a lot of the time or meet with the groups. And people don't understand what you are not receiving, what is not coming through, nor what is happening because the dollars aren't there. And everybody is trying to stretch those dollars because you don't want to say no to somebody whose life is being threatened, children whose lives are being threatened. So my first message to you today is we don't know what's happening if you don't tell us. So it's never been more important for you to tell us what is happening. We've been able to get some grants restored, and we've not been able to do others. Justice Department I'm going to try to behave. But HUD, I had a very good meeting with our regional HUD people last week, and you got to find the right person, and we're trying to get more money, but you need to tell us. But I'm also telling you that Gwen talked about what it's like to be an immigrant. Well, you know what the problem is right now? I had a young woman in my district that was brutally beaten, and the police were called, and she was deported. So I say to ICE, why somebody's life's threatened, and we're gonna deport them and not be able to help them when they need a helping hand? It's just morally wrong. The financial costs it's reminded me of COVID again. I mean, not that we ever really got over COVID, but people were in trapped situations. They didn't have access to a phone because the abuser was right there by them at all times. Some of the same problems are still there, that people feel financially dependent. They're worried. You know, my mother stayed with my father. I don't know, it was complicated. It's all situations are complicated because the Catholic Church at the time said you stayed together. You know, it's not good for the kids. You tell me what it's good about kids who think that their parents could snap like that at any second and that they could use a gun on you any minute. What's safe about that? What's safe about living in a house where violence is something that you accept? What's safe when a 15-year-old has to grab a gun from her mother who's using it for self-protection to keep them from killing each other? That's not safe. And we've got to continue to put the human face on what's happening out there. And with all due respect, the human face is not whatever she was, the Bachelorette. That's bringing attention that is just a distraction and not telling the story of what domestic violence is every single day. So you all are the hope. You are the advocates. You have to continue to make sure that we're out there. There are a lot of loopholes we still, not only are we going back and we're not doing the funding and not helping the survivors, but there are a lot of loopholes. Just, you know, on the simple, when someone gets a restraining order, they're not being served. I had a woman that was killed in my district. The restraining order had been issued 2 weeks before. He had a gun and shouldn't have had a gun while we were at it, and shot and killed her last fall. So we got work to do, and we got to work together to define that agenda, to ensure the programs that we currently have been able to pass get funded, to make sure we can, you know, that if there's a gun in the household or in the location, that altercation is happening, what the chances are that someone's going to be killed. We got to put the human face on it. We got to tell the story. We got to continue to define our agenda and not give up, because there are too many families, too many individuals that are counting on us to be the voice for those that don't have a voice for many reasons. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you, Representative Dingle, Representative Moore, for those moving remarks. So appreciate it. And that is part of what we're about ready to do right now, is to start putting a human face on it, to really start to tell those stories. So with that, I am going to bring to the podium Shahara Johnson.
Good morning, everyone. Just need to breathe. My name is Shaharia Johnson. I'm a domestic violence survivor, a teacher, a mother, and the CEO and founder of Silence Kills, a trauma-informed nonprofit organization that supports survivors through autistic expression, advocacy, and holistic healing. Before any of those titles, I am someone whose life was forever changed by domestic violence. In 2014, I graduated from American University. I was 22 years old and preparing to apply to graduate school. I had dreams, plans, and a future that felt wide open. But on August 14, 2015, everything changed. I was kidnapped and stabbed at least 14 times. The attack left me immediately paralyzed with an incomplete spinal cord injury called Brown-Séquard syndrome. At that moment, the life I knew came to a screeching halt. The Shaharia I once knew did not survive that night. I was first rushed to Prince George's Hospital and then medevaced to University of Maryland Shock Trauma Center in Baltimore. I spent 4 weeks there fighting for my life, where doctors told me I might never walk again. After that, I was transferred to MedStar National Rehabilitation Hospital in Washington, D.C., where I spent the next 4 to 5 months on bed rest. My days were filled with physical therapy, occupational therapy, and recreational therapy, week after week, while taking more than 15 medications each day. Every therapy session, every scan, every test was another step in my recovery, but it was also another bill. After that, I went on to complete another year of outpatient therapy. The medevac flight alone cost approximately $33,000, and that was just the beginning. As I fought to rebuild my body and learn how to live again, the bills began arriving at my home. One after another, they piled up. It felt like I was drowning in debt caused by someone else's violence. During this time, I was introduced to a resource called the Crime Victims Compensation Fund. With the incredible support of my mother, who advocated tirelessly on my behalf, we applied for assistance. She made multiple trips to the office, submitting medical bills, documentations of lost wages, and records of the financial losses caused by the attack. The Crime Victims Compensation Fund covered tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills. They helped replace the income I had lost when I could no longer work. They even provided financial support for modifications to my home so I can live there safely. Without that support, I would still be buried under hospital debt today. Financial support was only one part of the healing that I needed. I also received free therapy through the Went Center for Loss and Healing, an organization that receives federal funding to support survivors of violence and trauma. For 2 years, I attended therapy to process the emotional and psychological impact of what happened to me. The therapists I worked with helped guide me through one of the darkest periods of my life with compassion and patience. The Went Center also provided therapy for my mother, who developed PTSD after witnessing what happened to me. This is something that is often overlooked. Domestic violence does not only impact the survivor, it deeply affects the families who love them. Providing services for family members helps strengthen the entire support system around the survivor. The Went Center also offers support groups and healing programs that I was able to attend without cost. There were moments during my recovery when the pain, physical, emotional, and spiritual, felt unbearable. Moments when it felt easier to give up than to keep fighting. Times when it was hard to choose life. But therapy gave me tools. It gave me language for my pain. It gave me a path forward. Because of that support, I ultimately chose life. During this same period, I was also connected with a lawyer who helped me apply for Social Security disability income. Her name was Rachel Osborne. My application was denied more than once, but this attorney fought tirelessly on my behalf until I was approved. This legal assistance was provided at no cost to me. Without that advocacy, I likely would have not received the disability income, and without that income, I would have not been able to afford basic living expenses while recovering from such a life-altering injury. Another organization that profoundly shaped my journey is the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Through their Survivor Center programs, I was invited to participate in a public service announcement that uplifted the voices of survivors in DC. That opportunity helped me begin reclaiming my identity and using my voice. Today, I serve on their Survivor Advisory Board. Through that role, I have had the opportunity to advocate for survivors and contribute to policy discussions that impact domestic violence services in our city. Our board even met directly with administrators of the Crime Victims Compensation Program to provide feedback on how the program could better serve survivors. This is what survivor-informed policy looks like. And it is only possible because these organizations have the resources to support and elevate survivor voices. The truth is that during my recovery, I accessed many different services across Washington, D.C. All of them played a role in helping me rebuild my life. Healing from domestic violence is not just about surviving the moment of violence. It is about navigating the long road that comes after: medical recovery, financial stability, healing, healing from trauma, legal advocacy, housing, employment, and rebuilding your identity. Without funding for those services, survivors are left to navigate that road alone. It was already difficult enough to focus on my physical, emotional, and spiritual recovery. Without these programs, I would have also been crushed by financial stress and overwhelming barriers. Because these resources existed, I was able to focus on healing and eventually rebuilding my life. Today, I'm not only surviving, I am thriving. I am raising my child, I am teaching students, I'm leading a nonprofit, and advocating for survivors across my community. None of these things would have been possible without the network of support funded through domestic violence services. Funding for programs like the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, the Wentz Center for Loss and Healing, the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and all of the pro bono legal assistance is not just important, it is life-saving. I stand before you today as living proof of what is possible when survivors have access to these resources. For every survivor who finds healing because these programs exist, there are many others still waiting for support. Continued and expanded funding ensures that survivors who want to choose life have the support that they need to do so. I'm here today because these programs were there for me, and I urge you to ensure that they remain there for the survivors who come after me. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now I would like to pass it over to Vivian.
Shaharia, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. I'm so grateful you're here. Good afternoon. Thank you to NNEDV for convening us here today, and special thanks to Representatives Dingell, Moore, and Fitzpatrick for your leadership. I'm grateful to be in community with all of you. My name is Vivian Huelgo, and I'm President and CEO of Esperanza United. Since 1982, Esperanza United has been mobilizing Latino communities to end domestic and sexual violence. And although a federally funded National Resource Center, our work is fully grounded in the community, guided by lived experience, cultural knowledge, and the understanding that solutions come from within the communities most impacted. More than 4 decades ago, our founders created El Refugio, a place of safety, hope, a safe space for Latina survivors in St. Paul, Minnesota, who were not being reached. That legacy of a safe space continues today. Each year, we serve 600 individuals through our family advocacy program, and we respond to more than 1,500 calls through our bilingual, statewide crisis line. Today, I want to talk to you about the importance of investing in victim services and, equally important, culturally specific services. When we invest in victim services, we invest in prevention, we invest in healing, we invest in safer communities for everyone. Strong victim services are not just about responding to a specific crisis. They are the foundation, the cornerstone of public safety, economic stability, and healthy, thriving families. But right now, across this country, funding for victim services has declined, grants have been canceled, and new vital funding opportunities have not been afforded. The consequences of this is very, very real. Programs are being reduced, staff positions are being cut, and organizations like mine are being asked to do much, much more with fewer resources. At the same time, we saw up close, up front, the escalating impact of unchecked, aggressive immigration enforcement on survivor safety in Minnesota. Take, for example, Catalina's story. Catalina and her husband stopped going to work due to the fear of expanded immigration enforcement from Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota. Like many of the families we work with, and many families in the Twin Cities, what started out as a temporary adjustment became something much longer. 1 week became 1 month and became then 2. Over time, she began experiencing more and frequent intense verbal outbursts from her partner. And while she did not call it or name it domestic violence, she simply said she was scared and she wanted a way out. She shared this with a staff person at her child's school. And because of the work that we do at Esperanza United within schools, in school programs, this staff person knew to contact us and reached out. We walked through options with Catalina in her native language in Spanish so that she could make informed decisions that felt safe, that felt right, on her own pace, on her own timeline. This is what survivor-centered, culturally specific support looks like. But her story leaves me and us with an important question. How many survivors never reach us, never get to us? Because right now, we're only beginning to see the full impact of policies like Operation Metro Surge. Many more families are afraid to leave their homes. More households are experiencing financial instability. And at the same time, our ability to be in the community and to be present, well, it's shrinking. When funding is cut, organizations cannot be present within the community. We cannot build that trust with survivors before a crisis happens and escalates. Since 2025, callers to our crisis line are increasingly afraid to engage, to share information, to even share their names with us, or to fully engage with us. They're afraid to contact the police, afraid to even go to the hospital for medical care, and certainly afraid to go to court. They're afraid to leave their homes, and they're afraid to stay. Abusers know this. They use the threat of immigration enforcement as a tool of control, telling survivors, if you leave, you'll be deported and you will be separated from your children. And they see this happening. We continue to show up at Esperanza United. We have stretched our resources further than ever before. We have expanded our financial assistance to help families pay rent, keep the lights on, keep the heat on in Minnesota. We've gotten creative. We've provided virtual services when families were literally afraid to leave their homes. We've had meals delivered so they can get basic needs met. And because we are part of the fabric of the community, our staff, our volunteers, they have been targeted as well. We've had to step up and provide hazard pay for the staff who work at our refugio, because now just going to work is a threat, is a risk for our staff. We've had to increase mental health supports for our staff to address beyond the burnout, the trauma of the experience of Operation Metro Surge. We cannot keep doing this alone. When survivors are able to reach us, like Catalina, we can see all that is possible for them. Our advocates help survivors develop safety plans, understand their rights, assert their rights, access shelter if they wish. We can support survivors with accessing orders of protection. We have facilitated short-term rental assistance. We connect survivors to food banks, to English classes, to workforce opportunities. We have helped survivors validate educational credentials from their home country and move towards more stable employment. We can do all of this, that transformation from crisis to stability. It doesn't happen because of a single service or intervention. It happens because of consistent, culturally specific, wraparound support and resources. Because survivors navigating violence, language barriers, complex, complicated systems that are hard to navigate, and economic instability need more than referrals. They need accompaniment, support that honors their dignity, their self-determination, and their right to make decisions for themselves on their own timeline. Today, we ask leaders to protect and strengthen funding for victim services, to ensure that all survivors can seek help without fear, without intimidation, and to invest in our culturally specific programs in communities where survivors can trust that they are accessing culturally specific services. We know that when survivors are supported, communities are safer, families are more stable, and systems work more effectively for everyone. When we invest in survivors, we invest in all of us. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Molly.
I'm gonna get this mic a little closer. Thank y'all for being here. Thank you for having me. We have a saying in Texas, thanks y'all. So I like to start there. To NNEDV, who does this and so much more, as a state coalition representative, I want to say thank you. I can't imagine what it takes to get here. So thank you. You were amazing. I also want to say thanks to every advocate in all the states, but especially in mine, because these numbers are counted by advocates who have the jobs Vivian was describing. They are answering hotlines. They are making sure people have shelter beds and making sure to get this count. So thank you to every Texas advocate. I'm partial, but I think they are the best in the business. I want to thank my team at TCFV. So to get this data means the state coalitions are working. My colleague Anna, Malina, and Maya did amazing work to do this, so thanks to her. And then I want to say thanks to every survivor who, because it's not a number, right? Like at the end of the day, it's Molly, it's Shari, right? When we use these numbers, we have to make sure that we don't get blindsided by, oh, that's a huge number. Every single number is one of you, right? And if 1 in 2 of us are survivors, right, then instead of looking at the number, it's a Molly we're talking about. So really staying grounded in who that is for me. I'm an advocate of heart. I was one for many years. I'm a daughter of an advocate. My mom was an advocate all my life. I'm a sister of an advocate. So really kind of keeping that essential to what we're talking about today. I'm also a policy person. I've been with the coalition, I think, and credit Cindy's over here. I was here the year they started the DV counts. And I was like, brilliant. But I've been with policy for almost 20 years in Texas. And some people will be like, oh, is that hard? And I'm like, absolutely not. I never get tired of being on the right side of history. I never get tired of making change for every survivor I stood with that something went wrong. And so all of you here today are doing that by showing up. So thank you. A little bit about Texas. How many of you have been to Texas? I know I got my friends in the back, but okay. So y'all know the jokes are true, right? It's as big as you can imagine. So for me to cross the state, right, could take a whole day. For me to go, let's say from Port Arthur, one of our cities that might still smell like Louisiana, all the way to El Paso is a day, and they are completely different communities, right? For me to come from McAllen and the Rio Grande Valley, right on the border, on the ocean, all the way up to, some people call it the Panhandle, I call it the Top Hat, Amarillo, these are not the same communities, right? So what a survivor in Texas needs is gonna be different everywhere. But what I do know about survivors in Texas is that we are 1 in 10 of every one of these counts. We have a huge amount of need. In our state, over 65,000 survivors seek services every single day in our state. And they do that on their worst day, right? So we have to kind of keep in mind, I always say shelter's no place anybody wanted to go. And that you had the absolute worst thing happen with the person who was supposed to love you. You probably didn't have that next step to go, so you called a shelter. In our state, over 250,000 calls are made to a domestic violence hotline, yet another 250,000 calls made to law enforcement. And for our programs, which they are amazing, in our state, over half the time, 51% of the time, you will be told, no, we are too full. That is one of Texas's huge capacity problems. In Houston, our Metroplex, it could be 80% of the time you'll be told, no, we are too full. We recently worked with an amazing research team. Again, we're biased because they're from Texas. The Violence and Injury Prevention Center at UT Health Houston. And we said, we have to understand what's happening when you're being told no. And so they spoke with 100 survivors and said, you know, what happened? Where did you go? 60% of the time they said, well, I went back. Or I lived on the street or in a car. And so for us, kind of not moving ourselves out of sight of this and saying that means that many people are in a car after violence. That many people went back to violence. For a survivor's needs, because we remember we're a Molly, we're a Melina, it's different. We cannot say one need is for everyone. But what we can say, and I think Vivian said some of this, it's some of the very basic needs. Like our research is showing that a Texas survivor is food insecure. They don't even have access to the next meal, right? Housing is one of our #1 needs. I was not surprised to see in the census that 79% of Texas programs said they needed more shelter. I also will say that our 3rd top service was bilingual support. Texas is a bicultural experience. You can go to Laredo and have 1 foot here and 1 foot here, and I am in Texas and Mexico. And if you have never been down there to understand and live the experience of being a Texan, you're not surprised that bilingual support is a critical need. We also saw legal support. For many survivors, 1 step is housing, and 1 is I absolutely need an attorney to help me make the next step. I want someone to get me a custody modification, a divorce, a protective order. So I was not surprised to see those were some of Texas's top needs. In Texas, we take seriously the needs of underserved communities. We just completed a huge project, and we had this amazing group of researchers that we met with and said, how do we go about this? And they said, stop asking us what we need. You know it, and you haven't done it. So you can come back and ask us again what we need, or you can start lifting up best practices. You can start speaking about what we know is working. And so what we know is that to have a survivor experience violence is a lot, but if you also have multiple identities intersecting that can create additional barriers, we need to have tailored services. We need to address those needs. In Texas, one of the things we raise up quite often is making sure we support immigrant survivors of violence. There are laws on the books to protect those survivors, and we will make sure everyone understands them and supports them. I think I mentioned I started as an advocate. I was a hotline advocate for many, many years. I will never forget every single, mostly woman, who called me. They were never at a moment to be like, sure, let's talk about that, right? Because again, remember, to call a hotline is to flee violence, generally speaking. And so we've often said the only thing we need to be caring about is how to get you in and how to get you what you said you needed. I think we also are working in this report to look at the structural inequities that are being created for underserved communities. How can we create pathways to help, hope, and healing that are centered on each community's needs rather than one standard? I have to kind of end a little bit on prevention. So I noticed we had over 2,000 folks educated that day. And I had the privilege to be on an IRB and be a formal researcher, and we went out, we had this question, y'all, we thought it was so smart. And we said, if you had a magic wand, what service would you want? Thinking folks would say housing, legal. They looked at me and said, I'd want to have never met you. You seemed nice. She was very sweet about it. She seemed nice. I wish I had never met you because I was 45 when someone told me what love should have looked like. Why wasn't I told that that wasn't love when I was young? And so I think we have to stop thinking that prevention's like a bonus or an add-on, because the biggest thing is that you never met me. It's the biggest intervention we could ever invest in is a future, right? Like, it's great to work you out of business. Even better to never even talk about it, because we've created these communities free from violence. And it never has moved from me. Whenever someone starts to get like, oh, prevention, I'm like, no, they wanted to never meet you. That's the answer to what we're doing. A big part of how we do that is funding, right? A lot of folks spoke about it. I know Melina will, but it's pretty imperative that we not only focus on keeping level funding for things like the Violence Against Women Act, Family Violence Prevention Services Act, but that we increase our Victims of Crime Act funds. Many of our states, like Texas, have stood in the gap. They have put almost $500 million over 6 years in Texas into funding the gap, but it will not sustain as the economy holds. So we need to make sure that those funds rise up. We also need to make sure that we give flexibility on those funds, right? Because if we're gonna ask people what they want and need, well, then we really need to do it, which means we need to have money for flexible funds. We need to have money for food and housing of choice. And if you're like, okay, this has been a lot of a briefing, what can I do? I think the first thing, if you're walking back to your office, is thinking about that 1 and 2. Hold that, maybe someone here in the room has experienced it. Maybe it's your loved one. Hold that person when you see a bill or a funding package. Keep in mind you are funding the future. 1/3 of every Texan in a program is a child, right? So if we can create safe homes and safe futures for those children, then we have futures free from violence already. And then know that a decrease means that loss of services. And I think one advocate, and I think y'all said it too, said domestic violence programs are not about the emergency. They're about rebuilding a new life for a survivor and their family. So I think I get to introduce Melina, and thank y'all for having me.
Well, that is going to be a very hard act to follow. First of all, just thank you to our panelists for their incredibly moving and powerful remarks. My name is Melina Milazzo. I'm the Director of Public Policy for the National Network to End Domestic Violence. I really just want to say that these remarks really help to bring life to the numbers that Tanya shared with us in the beginning, and which are featured in the domestic violence counts reports. And regrettably, none of this is surprising. This is our 20th annual domestic violence counts. We've seen some changes. They still remain steady. Advocates are doing amazing work across the country with very little resources, and yet the demand continues to outpace the resources that are being provided. So today, my job is to really talk about what can we do. So as we heard from Shahari, access to immediate and long-term comprehensive support and services helped her find safety and set her up for longer-term stability. Vivian provided us with a glimpse into the importance of culturally specific services for so many survivors. And Molly's remarks really helped us to see how vital federal funds are in meeting the complex and comprehensive needs of survivors like those featured in the Domestic Violence Counts report. And as I said, despite the progress that we have in reducing domestic violence over the last 40 years, many victims are still trapped in life-threatening situations. And addressing domestic violence calls for all of us, including a government-wide approach and programs that work together to provide a comprehensive response. NNEDV is grateful that Congress continues to invest in domestic violence programs that provide life-saving services to survivors, and that in fiscal year 26, Congress maintained or increased core funding for domestic violence shelters and supportive services. But as DV count reports reveal, and as our panelists have so powerfully presented, the needs of countless survivors are still going unmet, and increased investments are critical to meeting the immediate and long-term needs of every survivor. To our congressional audience, you know we're in the midst of fiscal year 27 appropriation season. Yay. Member requests in the House have mostly been submitted, and Dear Colleague letters are mostly closed now, but member requests in the Senate are open, and senators still have the opportunity to sign on to Dear Colleague letters supporting these asks. We urge your continued support as the appropriations process moves through committee and final passage. For more information, please review our fact sheet and appropriations chart at the back of the room to see our federal funding priorities for Violence Against Women Act programs at the Department of Justice, Family Violence Prevention and Services programs at the Department of Health and Human Services, housing programs at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and funds via the Department of Homeland Security to address the needs of immigrant survivors. In fiscal year 2027, we're asking Congress to release $2 billion for Victim of Crime Act programs, also known as VOCA, and reject proposals that use the VOCA fund to pay for other DOJ programs, since that reduces funding for direct victim services. VOCA uses non-taxpayer money from the Crime Victims Fund for programs that serve victims of crime, including state formula victim assistance grants. Shahara talked a little bit about the Victim Compensation Fund that she was able to access. As part of VOCA, in addition to providing compensation to individual victims of crime, there are state victim assistance grants. And these funds, which are generated by fines and penalties from federal prosecutions and non-prosecution and deferred prosecution agreements, support services to over 6 million victims of all types of crimes annually through over 6,000 direct service organizations such as domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers, and child advocacy centers. Sustained VOCA funds are needed to respond to the dangerous lack of available services for victims. Local programs are still grappling with the devastating 40% cut from fiscal year 23, which was compounded by previous cuts in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 21 due to shrinking deposits into the Crime Victim Fund. And Molly touched a little bit about how many states have been able to backfill some of these cuts, but that backfill is coming to an end. And so states and territories need a steady stream of funding that can be relied on consistently. Cuts jeopardize survivor safety. That's why we're also calling for the Senate to pass the Bipartisan Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act, which was overwhelmingly passed in the House by unanimous consent with 327 co-sponsors. The bill would direct excess funds collected through the False Claims Act into the Crimes Victim Fund through fiscal year 29, stabilizing the Crime Victim Fund at no cost to the taxpayer. And it would support millions of victims of crime. Second, Congress should provide $500 million for Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, also known as FIPSA programs. FIPSA is the only federal funding source solely dedicated to domestic violence shelters and programs. The programs in the DV Counts report simply would not exist without FIPSA funds. FIPSA funds emergency shelters, crisis hotlines, counseling, victim assistance, and other vital services for more than 1 million victims and their children each year in every state and territory and in many tribes. FIPSA is a formula grant program in which 70% of the formula funds go to every state and U.S. territory. However, due to the small pot of money that runs through the formula, local direct services program end up with a very small per program funding level, some as much as $80,000, but many much lower. That's not even enough to cover a staff person. That's why it's imperative to increase FIPSA formula funding. One of the House Dear Colleagues letters that is still circulating is the bipartisan House Labor HHS letter led by Representatives Kim, Fitzpatrick, McBath, and Moore. If your representative has not yet signed on to the letter, please reach out to Representative McBath's office. We're also urging Congress to include $26 million for the Domestic Violence Prevention Enhancements and Leadership through Alliances, or Delta Prevention Program, which is administered by the CDC. Delta is the only dedicated federal funding source for the primary prevention of domestic violence. Further, we're urging Congress to fund $35 million for supporting a culturally specific public health approach for survivors program. As Vivian made clear, culturally specific programs are a vital access point for many survivors. Third, Congress should fully fund Violence Against Women Act Department of Justice programs at $1.16 billion. VAWA provides a comprehensive approach to addressing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And VAWA programs such as STOP and SASP are formula grants that go out to every state. But there are also key VAWA programs that ensure that victims are safe and communities have the resources to respond to an array of needs. And as our panelists in the report indicated, there's a desperate need for housing among survivors. The VAWA Transitional Housing Program helps communities in every state give victims a survivor-centered, safe place to begin to rebuild their lives. We're urging Congress to provide $100 million for OVW's Transitional Housing Program. Also, as we heard from our panelists, and as you can read in the report, legal assistance is a critical lifeline for survivors. However, the retainers or hourly fees for private legal representation are beyond the means of most victims of domestic violence. Legal services are second only to medical services as the most requested need of victims. The Legal Assistance for Victims program, also called LAV, is the only federally funded program designed to meet the legal needs of victims. We urge Congress to provide $100 million for LAV as a sound investment in long-term solutions to violence. Additionally, we're asking Congress to provide $42 million for culturally specific services within VAWA, again, given the importance of culturally specific services for so many survivors. Fourth, Congress should allocate $75 million for HUD's domestic violence and sexual assault housing program to help survivors access safe, affordable housing and rebuild their lives. As we've been hearing, survivors of domestic violence often must flee their homes to escape life-threatening violence. Domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness among women and children. Survivors' housing needs are met through a combination of funding sources, and the DVSA bonus funds support victim-specific housing and supportive service projects to assist survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence, and offer a stable funding source for victim service providers to address the unique safety needs of survivors. Finally, as we heard today, immigrant survivors often face barriers when seeking safety and protection. We urge Congress to provide funding to support immigrant survivors, that no funds are used to apprehend, detain, and remove immigrant survivors, and to also recapture unallocated U visas to help reduce the backlog and support family reunification efforts. We call on Congress to invest in these programs that reduce barriers for survivors by providing shelter, housing, legal assistance, culturally specific services, prevention, and so much more, and reject any proposals that would cut these funds. I really want to thank everyone here for being here today and for your support of survivors and the programs that provide life-saving services. I want to thank each of the panelists again for your powerful and moving remarks, and of course the NNEDV staff for being able to put together this remarkable report and also this briefing. Please pick up your Domestic Violence Council National Summary and state summaries in the back if you haven't, and also please feel free to pick up a brownie or other snack on your way out. Thank you all again for being here.